China exhausted with the COVID lockdown, but I don't think they're going to grow and accumulate and become a strong challenge to the regime, because I think that the Xi Jinping regime has got society pretty much under control with all of the surveillance methods that they have and with the strong police presence, so they can really snuff out demonstrations. I also don't think that the population is really quite so angry that they're ready to overthrow the regime. We see that kind of a movement in Iran today, but I think in China, there's still a lot of support for the regime. Even though they're tired with the lockdown, there's a lot of support for the regime for various reasons. Nationalism is a reason, propaganda is a reason, the sense that China is being treated unfairly in the world is a reason. The fact that China has been through so many years of economic growth and many people's situations have improved. The fact that the urban population that's been demonstrating is a middle class that is fearful of disorder and really doesn't want, they want the regime to lighten up, but they don't want to overthrow it. So that's number one. Number two, the regime has responded, apparently. It is easing up on the COVID restrictions, so that should be another reason why the demonstrations won't grow and grow and grow the way that they did in 1989, but instead will have already pretty much receded, and people will calm down and wait to see what the government does. But number three, the course of events, 3 years of lockdown has shown that zero COVID is not going to work. Apparently Xi Jinping has gotten that message now. But how to get out of zero COVID without a public health disaster is a big problem. I'm pessimistic about that too. Why? Because first of all, the Chinese vaccines, Sinopharm and Sinovac, supposedly are not as good as the Western mRNA regimes. Now, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, and I hear different things about this, but that's one thing I've read. Secondly, the vaccination rate among elderly persons is not very high. So some of my Chinese friends have told me that their grandparents have been told in the past by Chinese doctors, don't get the vaccine, you could have a side effect, you could get sick. Now the government is changing the story and saying you should have it, it's fine, nothing will happen to you, but there is this vaccine reluctance. So can the government force older people to get the vaccine, and can they do it fast, is going to be a big problem. And then they don't have enough intensive care units. So now I'm very worried that as the government eases off, the virus will spread very rapidly. The government is putting out this story that the Omicron current variant is not that dangerous, but I think, it's definitely dangerous to a certain proportion of the population, and it spreads very fast. So I'm really worried now that as they ease up, the virus is going to spread very fast and, kill a certain number of people, a certain percentage, even a small percentage of the Chinese population is a huge number of people. So those would be my opening comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Nathan. Next, we will have Mr. Tongbiel to give his opening statement. And after all of the opening statements are given, we will move into a short discussion and a Q&A session. So without further ado, Mr. Tongbiel, please stay there.
Okay, thank you very much. You can hear me. We know after 1989, the Tiananmen democracy movement, Tiananmen massacre, Zhou Fengshu played a very important role in 1989, the Tiananmen democracy movement. For 33 years, we haven't seen this kind of protest in China. People in Shanghai chanting that Xi Jinping stepped down, the Chinese Communist Party stepped down in Chengdu, Beijing, and some other cities. People were protesting against not only the zero COVID policy, but also the people there were demanding freedom and democracy in Chengdu. People shouted that no autocracy, we want a democracy. So it's a shock to many people in China and outside China. But please make no mistake, protests in China is not rare. In China, there are hundreds of protests every day. So in 2010, 2011, there was an official number, official statistics, like every year China has 200,000 protests, including all in Chinese it's called 群体性事件, all those kind of incidents involving in 5 people or more. So and regarding the zero COVID policy, people everywhere in China, we can see from online social media that people broke out and they don't want to be quarantined at home or a residential area. So there have been a lot of protests against the rotating lockdown, the unnecessary quarantine, like that. That's one thing. But this wave of protest, we call it the A4 revolution or white paper revolution. That's really special. It's different from the other protests, like against forced eviction or labor abuse or other social and economic issues. And the political meaning of this A4 revolution is clear. People have been fed up with not only the zero COVID policy, but also Xi Jinping's brutal crackdown on the civil society. So it's not only about the past 3 years. Of course, most of the people who took to the street are not happy with the zero COVID policy, but many Chinese people, or more and more Chinese people, are angry at the atrocities committed by the authorities. The roundup of human rights lawyers, the shutdown of non-governmental organizations, and the Hong Kong's one country, 2 systems have been destroyed. And in Tibet, there's a cultural genocide in Xinjiang, the Uyghur genocide. So all these kind of things have been accumulating, and then so many people have been very frustrated and angry at the government policy, not only policy, but by Xi Jinping himself. And in China, we know if you are against Xi Jinping, now you are against the Communist Party. That Xi Jinping, it's like a Mao Zedong era. That Mao Zedong equals to the Communist Party, and anti-Mao is anti the party. So now Xi Jinping has turned the Chinese Communist Party from a small group dictatorship in Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao era to a one-man dictatorship, a personal dictatorship, and then to challenge Xi Jinping himself is challenge the political legitimacy of the Communist Party. When I was in China, I promoted the rights defense movement, the Weiquan movement, and as I observed, there were like 4 trends of the rights defense movement between 2003 and 2013-14. when Xi Jinping came to power. It's like it's politicization, organization, and more street activism, and more internationalization. So and we know in after 1980s, 1990s, there was kind of an intellectual liberalization, and not only intellectual. There's from the government, there's the economic reform, the democratization reforms, and the administrative and legal reforms, and the media, traditional media, and internet have more and more space. And then the civil society in China was developed quite amazingly, especially in Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao era. And that's why Xi Jinping was so nervous about the rising power of the civil society. And that's why Xi Jinping started a so brutal crackdown on the civil society. He arrested a lot of human rights lawyers and dissidents and human rights defenders, and he targeted journalists, media, internet, universities, underground churches, Tibetans, and Hong Kongers, Uyghurs. So that's a comprehensive crackdown, and he waged a war against the law. And so I think that's the background, that more and more Chinese people are not satisfied with Xi Jinping's policy, and you know, in 2018 he removed the presidential term limit from the constitution, and that made even party officials and government officials not happy. And so the last point I can make is the Xi Jinping is facing a COVID dilemma, because if he loosened the zero COVID policy, and then the first, he doesn't want to encourage the protesters, and the protesters will see, you know, the Communist Party can make compromise, and the protests could work. And second, the vaccine, as Professor Nathan said, the vaccination is not so effective. So many elderly people are not vaccinated, and China is lack of ICU and hospital equipment, and that's one thing. And then Chinese government refused to import more effective vaccinations. But if the current zero COVID policy continues, and then the more and more Chinese people would be angry, and then it's possible that suddenly there might be another wave of protest, and that's also a challenge to the political stability, and then economy. So for the past 3 years, we have seen China's economy is declining, and then in every authoritarian regime, economic crisis would also bring up social and political crisis. So that's the dilemma Xi Jinping and the Communist Party are facing.
Thank you, Dr. Tongbiel, for that elaborate answer. Now we welcome Mr. Zhou Fengsuo of the Humanitarian China to also provide his views on the current situation in China. Thank you. Zhou Fengsuo.
Thank you for having me. I was a survivor of the Tiananmen massacre. 33 years ago, I was on Tiananmen Square. To me, I always emphasize that most people remember the massacre. It was a tragedy. It was brutal, ruthless. But we also remember tankmen who stood up against this dominating state power. This was the symbol of last century. It's human spirit against machine, against dictatorship, and that's the spirit we are seeing today in the current protests. That's what excites me. For about 10 days, I was watching this every day. I was in Taiwan, and most of the protests happened in nighttime. So I woke up, I checked, I was in tears all the time. It's so exciting. I think this is not only limited to me, to everyone who saw people's call for freedom. There is a power in it that resonates everywhere, in every nation. I think that's in just our human nature, this call of freedom that can't be stopped. But of course, in China, why it's happening is because this zero COVID policy that has been so, so restrictive, that's limiting people's every ability of movement. It's putting people in prison in their own home. And it's burning people to death, the Uyghurs. And that's the kind of situation that could happen to everyone. That alarmed people, that triggered people to action. But I think the lesson we learned from it is not because just Xi Jinping he is stupid or too powerful. It's because there's no freedom. For a while, a lot of people believe in this China model, where it's brutal combination of modern technology with pervasive control, and they can do well in global trade and all that, and some people can enjoy the benefit. But in April, we saw the reality that people were starved to death in the most prosperous city, in Shanghai. This was one, I think the housing price is probably one of the top in the world, where you have no guarantee, your dignity, your property rights, nothing. So I think that's what's important. That's what's behind all the protests, the freedom, the call of freedom, or the lack of it in China. That's why it's getting the attention of the world now. There's just so many similarities between this current movement and what happened 33 years ago. The youthful, idealistic, young people protesting. The journey, like everyone goes through, from fearful to taking action, then saw each other encouraged by the small incremental action. And all that contributes to this flow of free spirit that exists not in a square like 33 years ago, but it exists in this virtual space, this virtual community that's engined by Twitter, Telegram, and Instagram. And we saw tremendous creativity of people, and the solidarity that you can find that's never possible. Like all of a sudden, Chinese people means different things, right? This is exactly what happened 33 years ago, where Chinese people were standing up. They were leading the world in challenging communism that eventually led to the collapse of Berlin Wall. That's exactly what's happened. And so far, I think there is already a victory. Just imagine, in the past, like Xi Jinping never made any concession. Right? He never acknowledged defeat. This is the first time. And just 2 weeks ago, how can you imagine China would be loosening up like this? It's impossible, right? So this is a victory. Of course, a lot of people pay price for it. A lot of people are in prison now. That's where we need to pay attention. And the great hero who started all this, Peng Lifa, we don't know where he is, where his family. We need to pay attention. We need to call for release of these people. But there is a victory. This is the first time that there is a triumph of public opinion against dictatorship. This is important, very significant in that. But of course, this is not enough. And for people who take comfort in this, you should realize here, going back to 2019, it's not the solution, because 2019's Shanghai could change into 2022, April, immediately, quickly, without any notice, because you have no guarantee, without human rights, without freedom, without rule of law. Everybody is subject to this kind of hellish situation. That's why we should continue this fight. That's why organizations like this, events like this, is so important here today. Yeah. Thank you all for coming. I think for the future challenge, there are quite a few. I hope there will be more on the ground connections between the protesters, and we can form some more formal organizations. Yeah. There is already like a liberation going on. Yeah. The majority of Chinese students overseas were definitely little pinks. Yeah. They were screaming at the Hong Kong protesters like 3 years ago, but all of a sudden it changed, and there's reconciliation going on between Chinese students and the Uyghur community and the Hong Kong community, and the acknowledgement of the sufferings of the Tibetan people. This is great, and we should continue this. And there is great value in this. For a lot of us in the last 33 years, like it seems that all the effort just futile. Yeah, whatever you do, like nothing changed. But we are seeing some result of it. Today's people, they are inspired by what happened 33 years ago. The human spirit that's there. And Peng Lifa, he was definitely motivated by what he observed on Twitter, the way he protests, his platform, and that appeals to people. I think that's where we can all contribute continuously, no matter where we are. But still, we need to organize, to connect with each other. The devil, this CCP is, it creates fear, division for people, for Chinese people. When we see each other, we're always fearful of being reported. That's what we need to overcome. And we have the opportunity to change that now, here, outside of China. We should overcome this fear, this wall of fear, and create our community of bonding, of free people. And that's important. That's what we should definitely continue going into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zhou and Dr. Tongbiel and Professor Andrew Nathan. We're going to get into a bit of a discussion about the current situation. I'm going to be using a few of the questions that were given to us before. So let's just start with Professor Nathan. You've talked a little bit about your pessimism in this situation, but our first question is, if you can tell us a little more about the risks and the processes of organizing demonstrations in China. If you can just go into that a little more and to explain to us what that implicates and what it might implicate for the future, for the upcoming future.
I don't even think that these demonstrations were organized. So let me talk about the risk simply of participating in the demonstration, and you can say that if they catch you as an organizer, then the risk is 10 times greater. But the risk of participating is, and it's not just a risk, I mean this is what has actually happened to people, is that the police take your picture, they recognize you from the picture, or they stop you at the demonstration or leaving the demonstration, and then some people they take away and interrogate them at the police station. Some people they visit them at their apartment and give them a warning. And so then so it seems to be more or less that level, but if you are, let's say, so I think Tongbiel mentioned this guy Peng Lifa who hung these banners on Sitong Chao in Beijing. Now that's a guy, he's not just participating in a spontaneous demonstration, but undertaking a planned act of opposition to the regime, because the banner that he hung was an anti-regime thing. He was arrested and has disappeared. Now, both Tongbiel and Feng Suo can tell you better than I can what very likely is happening to this individual. I would ask them. But the point is that the regime has so many police. They have scads and scads of police who show up on these places, and they can watch, they can grab you, they can beat you up. The regime has access to everybody's social media. The regime has cameras of retreat with facial recognition. If you are trying to communicate with other people on social media to say something like, let's all take a walk on Wuchi Lu at a certain time, which is not exactly organizing, but if you're sort of coordinating to turn out someplace, the police very probably know what message you've sent and what it means, although you may not say, let's explicitly say something like, let's all go out and demonstrate against Xi Jinping. But if you say something kind of coded, but the cops know what that means anyway, and they know that it was you that said it. So it's this blanket of surveillance is number one, and then number two is lots and lots of repressive muscle. So in Tiananmen, in 1989, a relatively small number of people gave a peaceful demonstration at first, and it was surprising that the cops didn't do anything, and the regime didn't do anything, and they didn't do anything for a long time, for about a month. About 10 days, and then the regime said something in the newspaper. But I mean, there wasn't any effective repression for about a month. And so that was very different. People were observing, oh, there's nothing happening, apparently it's okay. Today, it's not like that. The police were evident instantly. And so the message today is very different from the message in 1989.
Thank you, Professor Nathan. Gentlemen, I wanted to maybe direct that question to you. How you mentioned a bit about your views on these protests, and Mr. Zhou, you specifically mentioned how this could be an opportunity for different groups that once differed before to sort of unite together. But if you can just go ahead and tell us, Dr. Tongbiel first, about your views on the implications of what may happen in the future because of these protests. Some may say that the government, the CCP will fall. Some may say that it may go towards a route of reform. So I want to direct that question to you and to Mr. Zhou Fengsuo. So Mr. Tongbiel.
Yeah, so first, we know many Chinese people through this protest have overcome their fear. But they not only overcome their fear, but also their sense of being isolated. And then, in China, it's extremely dangerous to be critical of the government, and especially if you are against the regime, against Xi Jinping, you can't say it publicly. So you don't know other people who have the same idea. But through the protest, and then people, it's an extremely wonderful opportunity for them to know, oh, there are so many people who share the same feeling, who are not happy with the regime, and that's one thing that will bring profound impact to the future protest. And then the civilians. So I coined the term like a high-tech totalitarianism to emphasize the totalitarian surveillance empowered by DNA collection, like artificial intelligence, facial recognition, and I often talk about a case like last winter, the two human rights lawyers in China planned to go to Shanghai to visit Zhang Zhan and her mother, and suddenly their health code turned red. So the Chinese government could be very, very effective targeting human rights lawyers, activists, and the dissidents. And so if there is any protest like this, it must be decentralized. It must be spontaneous. And then the when there's an incident arousing the national anger, and then it's not impossible to have this kind of revolution even under such an unprecedented high-tech totalitarianism. And one more thing is the overseas Chinese. I think many of you are more familiar with the situation. So I was in a protest organized by Princeton University students, and then one of them talked about that he was hesitating, he was struggling whether or not to attend the protest and whether or not to give a public speech. And then he decided to come. He said, if I don't come, and then I'll be living in regret for the rest of my life. And only 1 month and a half ago, we know that after the Tongbiel, so many universities, the Chinese students posted like the anti-Xi Jinping posters on campus, but mostly unanimously. And then there are hundreds of people in Columbia. Here, maybe more than 600 people. So it's amazing. And that will so the overseas Chinese students and other Chinese people want to express their anger with the Communist Party, and then that's an important. It may be a turning point.
Thank you so much. Mr. Zhou, what is your view on this issue?
Yeah, I want to take the other side of Professor Andrew Mason's argument. I think there are lots of reasons to be pessimistic, but for people like me, every day I think about what I can do, what's within my reach to do it. I think that's the most important thing. That's what Peng Lifa, his example, tells people. Just think about it, all the surveillance, both physical, high-tech, everything that's going on. And he was able to do it. The sky of Beijing, when Xi Jinping was trying to crown himself, then the sky was filled with smoke, and the loudspeaker with banners calling for his removal, and that was heard by people very far away. He can do that. I think there are definitely lots of opportunities like that, and because of his example, for example, people came out with this idea of doing airdrop and toilet banners in toilet. And I actually talked to this guy who came out with this idea of using a pocket printer. So, because it's in your pocket, you can print anywhere, without being noticed. There are definitely always ways. And the other side is also very important, that people turn to exaggerate the power of this big machine. We would think it like an evil monster, like an evil god that's everywhere, watching your every move. No, it's not. It's a machine operated by people. So there are limits to it. For example, why Xi Jinping backed off this time? Because all the resources were exhausted even before this. All the control, the tighter the control, meaning you have to. There's a constraint on it, the resource, and that make it very brittle. That's why he backed off. So there's a cost to it, and this kind of regime can't last long. I think but the problem is that, for example, the freedom fighters in China are not getting any help from international community. That's the problem. Wall Street is pouring money in, and Apple, when people were doing this airdrop thing, the first thing, question will come out is that Apple will drop this. Guess what? It happened immediately. That's the kind of situation. That's we should definitely change from here. We cannot allow this global trade, all this technology, just to become a tool that empower this regime like that. We have to hold Apple accountable for this, and we have to do it here in the United States. That's where we definitely need lots of help. And I'm very disappointed for the last 33 years, for this country that's proud of all the innovations, there hasn't been any innovation that really challenge the firewall. And all the technology seem to help conquer freedom. And it's exactly the opposite of what the technology should do. And I would challenge any self-respecting programmers to do something big, to bring down this firewall. That's the biggest help Chinese people need, and we can definitely do a lot here on that. Actually, there is a hunger strike going on at Apple headquarters now in Silicon Valley, and we need to pay attention. The protester is Wang Han, and this is his second day already. He's not feeling well. I told him, in a way, this is quickly repeating the Tiananmen process again. But I wasn't a supporter of the idea of hunger strike, even though I was there to make sure that they are safe. But today I told him the same thing. But I admire his courage. That's how desperate we are, because it's so easy for Apple to turn on the switch and just shut off a big source of information for Chinese people. For example, restricting VPN and limiting airdrop, and creating this separate cloud for China, so that Chinese government has complete control of the information. All these, there should be a penalty for it. And I think that's very important to do. I think, so for now, from the positive side, it's very important to remember that this virtual community is working. There's a lot we can do to help each other, to share information, to devise plans. For example, Peng Lifa, when he came out, he dressed like a construction worker. And that was discussed on Twitter. People were talking how to avoid surveillance. That's one way you could do it, and that's what he did. So all these, you can think about ways to do it, and maybe someday it will help.
So thank you so much for that clarification. Now that leads me to our next question. You mentioned a little bit about the economy in China, and I guess Professor Nathan can also chime in as well. And please, for all the panelists, let's open this up to a sort of like an open discussion. You mentioned a bit about the economy, and the question is, and many are wondering if the buildup of the economic situation in China has, in a way, sort of contributed to the angers of the people, besides the zero COVID policies that's been implemented on the nation. And so if you can maybe just elaborate on that point, that'll be great. Professor Nathan, do you have maybe things to say?
Yeah, but I actually think François Tongbiel would be better. You know, yes, I think that is true. But they are in touch with lots of people in China, so let's hear their account of it.
Sure. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Dr. Tongbiel.
Yeah, so generally speaking, the economic growth in China has been the double-edged sword for Chinese politics. On the one hand, we have seen the global economy, global marketization, and then China has become the second largest economy in 2011, and then as to purchase parity power, China has become the #1 economy in the world. This, I just mentioned the civil society, like human rights lawyers, activists, and we have more resource than like a Mao Zedong era, Deng Xiaoping era. So that's kind of a resource. Most Chinese people become wealthier than before, and then there's like an intellectual liberalization. So that resource is very, very important for the mobilization of civil society, of any kind of a protest, and more and more Chinese, including myself. I was kind of brainwashed before going to university, and then I was awakened, and then decided to become a dissident human rights lawyer. And so that's the positive aspect of economic growth. But the Chinese Communist Party could also use its economic power, technical power, to strengthen its totalitarian surveillance. And then we can see like two different impacts during the COVID. That on the one hand, many Chinese people, including the middle class, including the migrant workers, many of them lost their jobs, and many of them have to rely on their job to feed the whole family, and so that's the zero COVID policy, which is anti-science, anti reason that brought a lot of suffering for so many Chinese people, and that's the most important, one of the most important elements of this Fall Revolution.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zhou.
Yeah, I think overall the economic factor is exaggerated in China. The CCP claims this, and a lot of people probably bought into this argument that CCP has a contract with Chinese people in that CCP would ensure the livelihood by economic development. And that's completely wrong. That's false. Why? Because there is no accountability to CCP. Like people without power, without freedom, there's no control. That basically leaves everything to CCP. There's no way for them, for example, to be held accountable. For example, last 3 years, the economy is in a disaster. Should Xi Jinping resign for that? Should the CCP apologize? Zero, nothing. And this is not first time. Jiang Zemin died, and he was buried yesterday. Yeah. For a lot of Westerners, they remember him as someone who opened the economy, whatever. But was it his intention? No. Why? Because, he gained credit in Deng Xiaoping's eye by first shutting down the world economic hero. That was like the only newspaper at that time that was a free newspaper. And after that, he sentenced 3 people deaths, just for trying to block the trains. And that's how he was chosen. He was chosen because he was a hardliner. He was a ruthless killer. And immediately after he took over for 3 years, he was trying to reverse everything that Zhao Ziyang did in opening up the economy. And in one of the facts that's listed as Zhao Ziyang's problem was meeting with Milton Friedman, this Chicago economist, for trying to open up China's economy. So it's only after 3 years they were in so much trouble that he had to change course. That's what happened. So another example, I think, the Great Famine of 1960. 40 million people died. There wasn't even any impact on the control of CCP. Actually, Mao solidified his control later during the Cultural Revolution. So if we look at the current situation, all these causes of misery, like economic collapsing, did nothing in Xi Jinping's mind. He wasn't going to change. It's only when people call for political change, people calling for CCP stepped up, Xi Jinping stepped up, that he was scared and he changed course. So I think that's definitely from my point that's my view. I don't think economic situation matter that much, and all these protests, like in tens of thousands, if it's only for economic grievance, it means nothing in the eye of CCP.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zhou, for that clarification. Now, that moves us to our next question. All three of you gentlemen mentioned a bit about how the CCP's policies has affected different groups. And we see what has happened in Urumqi, for example, because of the fire, 40 or so more souls have lost their lives. We also see Tibetans have been struggling for many years, as Mr. Tongbiel has said. We also see Hong Kongers protesting, and there are many resistance actually from the protesters themselves. And we also, of course, cannot forget the plight of the Southern Mongolians from Near Mongolia. So the question, though, from a lot of these groups, I guess, would be that how can this lead on to a reconciliation between the Chinese people themselves and all of these groups, and I would even dare to say, including yourselves, who have been fighting this regime for a very, very long time. What do you think is a path to reconciliation? Professor Nathan, if you have something to maybe contribute to that, I would also appreciate it as well.
I feel like it's better to hear from the other two and me come last instead of first for questions like this. They speak with more authority than I do.
All right, Mr. Tongbiel, if you want to.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's an important issue. Most Chinese people, I don't know how the percentage, but many Chinese Han Chinese people have the sentiment of Da Yitong, the great unity, the Han chauvinism, and they somehow not all of them, but somehow the Han Chinese, including the Han Chinese central government, they have a lot of policies discriminative against the ethnic minorities, the Tibetans and Uyghurs, and we know the Uyghur genocide. What the executives the government is using is to fight separatism, extremism, and terrorism. So, especially the separatism, when the Chinese government tells them the Uyghurs that are in the so-called re-education centers are advocating separation from the mainland China, and then most Han Chinese people would agree with the treatment. So that's very complicated. But we many of us have seen this wave of protest, the April Revolution. We see the Han Chinese people were chanting like Xinjiang 解封, so they open Xinjiang, open the whole country, and they were the Uyghur victims in Urumqi sparked the national anger, and so that kind of human nature, that fundamental humanity overcomes their sentiment of great unity, the so-called territory integrity, something like that. And of course, in the United States and other countries, we have seen the solidarity among Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kong, and Chinese activists. So because we are living in a free country, we can publicly speak out for those people that actually being persecuted more brutal than Han Chinese. So I think it's really a good start for the reconciliation, but there's a long way to go.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zhou Gongzhou, your view on this.
Right, I think I agree with Tongbiel largely on this. I think this is it's a tragedy that what happened in Urumqi. But I think for people who protest in Urumqi and in Nanjing and in Shanghai, this was like the first natural response, like as a human being, to sympathize others in distress. And for example, the 3-year child who died, 3 years basically, without seeing a normal life. That resonates with everyone. And also what happened, for example, in Shanghai, basically it illuminated that there is concentration camp everywhere. What happened in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Hong Kong, happened everywhere. And everybody is in this big prison. I think for anyone who can think, this is definitely a natural conclusion. So I think the current tragedy and the protests already have bonded people together, and we have seen it. For example, we had this protest this Sunday with other groups, and there are spontaneous someone apologizing to the Uyghurs in Southern California, USC, and other places. So this is, I think, it's the liberation of people's free spirit, our true nature. Once you are free from the bondage of indoctrination, brainwashing, that will come out naturally. And of course, the bigger background, I think, is overall, this Twitter community is always very open, free, all-embracing. I think that's the background. There is a consensus there that's driving the underground action. And of course, I think Peng Lifa had a great point to make. So he was so creative. Even after he was arrested, like a day later, he sent out this tweet on his Twitter. I'll read it. He said, 于智利革命，民国革命凡40年，目的在于中国之自由平等。即40年之经验，深知欲达到此目的，必须唤起民众及联合世界上以平等待我之民族。 共同奋斗. So he was calling for this. This all out of his personal reflection before he took action. This, I believe he definitely isn't alone in this. There's many people like him. So I'm very optimistic on this. But of course, there's a lot to do.
Professor Andrew Nathan?
I think the government sees Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong in the lens of national security. They consider these areas part of China's national territory, which they are. I guess they're recognized that way by the international community. And areas of the national territory that are at risk of, in the eyes of Beijing, of being separated from China because of populations that are not loyal and foreign interference. So from their point of view, it's a question of finding a solution to the security problem by exerting control. They also see Xinjiang and Tibet from a lens of atheism. The Chinese Communist Party leadership are doctrinaire atheists. They believe that religion is a superstition. They think that the Uyghur people and the Tibetan people are backward and are in the grip of backward, dangerous superstitions. Hong Kong is different because it's not an ethnic or religious minority. And so that's the way they view it, and I think most Chinese people really don't think too critically about that. I think they kind of see it in the same way, that these are backward territories or rebellious territories with foreign interference. So they, the central government needs to control them, and people in most of China don't really know how that control is being exercised, because one of the stories, actually it's not only a story, but one of the strategies by Beijing to control these territories is to pour investment in there and to move Han Chinese in there to quote-unquote develop or quote-unquote modernize. Here I'm talking about Tibet and Xinjiang, not Hong Kong. Although mainland China has also given economic privileges to Hong Kong as well. So I think a lot of Chinese citizens feel like, we're helping these people to develop. So when you speak about reconciliation, I think we're a long way from reconciliation, because I think for most Chinese in the majority of China, they don't really see it as a problem of reconciliation. So overseas, there is some, as Tongbiel mentioned, and I think Tongbiel alluded to it, that overseas where these communities have a chance to get out from under propaganda and meet one another and understand one another's situations, there's some small signs of mutual understanding, but that also is a long road, I think. So that some reconciliation may take place outside of China, but I don't see the conditions for that concept even being relevant yet, or sort of being raised in the minds of the most Chinese people inside of China.
Thank you so much for that insight, Professor Andrew Nathan. Now, we will move into open questions from our audience members. You do not have to identify yourself, but if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and we will pick up. So yes, right there. And please project if you can, so that everyone can hear.
Okay, so this is a question mainly for two gentlemen in the conference. So you guys all mentioned the reformers inside the CCP, like the elite class, will only speak up when the international society and the Western world make enough pressure on the Chinese domestic society. So to have a more democratic political environment, do you think China needs somebody like Alexei Navalny? Or do you think it's possible for China's current environment to have somebody like Navalny to be a peer? And also, how do we protect the person like Navalny, like Chinese version of Navalny? Because as Mr. Zhou said, Peng Lifai is kind of like that. But how do we protect that person to prevent the second Peng Lifai appears? And also, is that really inevitable to have Western power involved in it, or we can do it like all in like inside China? Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlemen, if you want to take that.
Yeah, so first, the international support is very, very important. But first, the condition is that the Chinese people must stand up to the regime. So like the A4 revolution, kind of that the Tiananmen democracy movement. So if there's no resistance in China, and then I think it's not likely that the Western support could play a role in overthrowing the CCP regime and democratized China. But I have been documenting the complicity of the global enterprises. So there are several levels. One thing is we hope the Western democracies, the international community should support the human rights and democracy in mainland China. And but at least the Western countries, the global companies should not facilitate China's censorship and China's totalitarian surveillance. They should not help the authoritarian totalitarian regime to tighten its control. And Feng Shui mentioned the Silicon Valley companies. So one example, Apple is one of the worst, but like a Cisco and other companies, they provide Chinese government with technology, equipment, and trainings to establish and tighten the Great Firewall. And that's something we should condemn, and that's something we should stop. And like like another Peng Lifai, it's so I said the future protest must be decentralized and spontaneous. And several years I was talking with journalists, like the famous influential human rights activists and dissidents, like Gao Zhisheng, Hu Jia, and so anyone who are famous in China must be monitored very closely. So normally these people, so they have contributed a lot and sacrificed a lot and deserve our respect. But in the future protests, these people are monitored very much, and they can't do very much. And these people in Chinese police called 重点维稳对象. So the important targets for stability maintenance, like that. And and technology. So there are nuanced discussions of technology. The safe communication is important, and then the civil consciousness is important. And if only a few Chinese people want a liberal democracy, and then that won't work. There must be millions of Chinese people not only want a political change, but also decide to take actions to make a change.
So much. So Zhou Fengshui, your
Okay, yeah, I will answer. I never said that there's a different faction within CCP. My focus is always on civil society, on grassroots organizations. In my opinion, after Tiananmen massacre, like there's no reformer, zero in the CCP. Of course, in the future, if they are desperate, we welcome them to join the opposition. But I don't think there is such a person now, because CCP's system always make sure that they all benefit, and to some degree they all have blood in their hands. That's the mechanism that works. So how they are bonded together. I remember this famous sentence from Professor Fang Lizhi. I think that's also true today. He said, 民主不是自上而下赐予的，是自下而上争取的。那我们今天 the situation we are facing now is the same. So democracy will not be granted from the authorities. It has to be won by people through fighting, courage, and action. That's what's needed today. That will be the driving force for China's change. As to international help, I think Tongbiel has made it right, correct. Like, so far, the blood, like the power of CCP, a lot of it comes from Wall Street and technology companies. We just need to make sure that they are not enablers in this. I think that's a good step forward. For now, basically, like the Apple situation, where the workers were basically jailed and forced to work without medical, even food. That's the kind of situation that's happening because a lot of U.S. companies are benefiting from this system of kind of slavery kind of situation in China. That has to be changed. I think that's where Chinese people need some support. At least stop colluding with this regime, the U.S. companies, institutions.
One more point is I agree with Feng Shui that there is not a single reformer within the CCP, but I mean many leaders in the Communist Party maybe not as brutal, as radical as Xi Jinping, but all of them don't want to label democracy or like the Western style democratic system. But when the civil society is rising up, when the resistance is so powerful that they have the possibility to overthrow the regime, and then I believe the party reformers will appear. And then, so at that time, they'll make a calculation, to stand together with the people is a better choice at that time. So most important thing is the resistance, the actions from the people in China.
Well, yes.
On top of that, in that case,
Can you project so that?
on top of that, what do you think is more likely to happen? The dissolution of the CCP party or the emergence of another party? Or having another leader after Xi to, like on top of this set, to have a reformer within the party and to achieve everything that we're working for now, which is democracy, civil rights, and human rights. We know that it will not happen under the control of CCP. So in order to achieve that, what do you think is more likely to happen? The dissolution of CCP, like the Soviet Union, or the emergence of another party? Do you get that?
Yeah, I know. So last year, Professor Andrew Nathan and I co-led a seminar that will China democratize. And this year we had a similar seminar in Chinese too, like 中国向何处去. So in general, I deeply believe China will be a democracy and Chinese people will enjoy freedom and democracy. But we don't know how long it will take. We don't know how that political change will take place. And I think, in my opinion, Chinese people or the Chinese government has lost the chance to have a smooth and peaceful transition like what we have seen in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Taiwan. So I think and it's not possible for the Communist Party to reform, to lead a meaningful political democratization. They won't do that. So what we need is a revolution, not a violent revolution, but a non-violent revolution, as what we just saw last week. And again, one I don't know when or how, but when there's resistance, a powerful resistance, like in 1989, there will be a lot of amazing change. Like in 1989, Zhou Fengshu knows more than me. The CCTV, the military magazines, so all those the party's machine, the party's official universities, official think tanks, all of them took to the street and to want to be together with the people.
Do you think 1989 was more likely to be the turning point for Chinese people like Poland and Taiwan, and we sort of missed out on that already? Do you think the 1989 movement was more likely to be the turning point for Chinese people, just like Poland and Taiwan, like the political reform, and we sort of like missed out on that? If we actually like hold on to it in 1989, it could be different right now. What do you think of that?
Yes, of course. There are lots of possibilities, and you are right in mentioning Poland and Taiwan. I think these two countries benefited from the Tiananmen protests directly. For me, because we're working on this Tiananmen Museum, so this year lots of facts just came to me. So there are two relics that's very important. So both on exhibition at Victim of Communism Museum now, but most people probably don't realize the connection. I think the first one is still in my home gallery. So there is this flyer that's like the earliest flyer of 1989 by student organization. And that's calling for national solidarity student union. So the solidarity name came from Poland, because Poland at that time was the most advanced in terms of organizing civil society and forcing the government to talk into direct dialogue. That's why in 1989 we were calling for dialogue. We were inspired by Poland. And the day of June 4 massacre was the first major election in Poland. And that's when the Solidarity Union won the election. And I met someone whose parents were with the Solidarity movement, and she told me the story to me. Yeah, they remember this. And same in Taiwan. Yeah, when Li Tenghui was only in power superficially, because he didn't have any control of the military, or that similar to Zhao Ziyang. But when the students of Taiwan staged the protest, eventually they united with Li Tenghui, and Li Tenghui told them, I've been waiting so long for you to rise up like this. And that's how he eventually turned the public opinion into political power and pushed Taiwan's democratization into fruition. That's what's happened there. And of course, yeah. For us, I think we always, it's very dark now. It's impossible to imagine. But our imagination is always limited. So it's easy to be pessimistic now, but we must remember, there's always hope. And it's in our human nature. We love freedom. We want democracy, and that will happen.
Thank you, Mr. Zhou. Now, because of the time constraint, if you can just kind of summarize your question, that will be more than appreciated. Now, we will take 2 questions in a batch. So, now, quick question from one of the virtual audiences. Very quickly, gentlemen, the fall of the CCP does not automatically mean that the peaceful establishment of democracy. Do you think China may fall into another warlord era? And how could such scenario be avoided? So there's one. Now, we're going to take two more questions and 2 more questions afterwards. So, get it.
What, in your opinion, are the major tasks and missions of the grassroots organizers overseas, those who want to help, like here, the student activists, or should they act accordingly, strategically?
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so in the past few days, we've all witnessed the U-turn in CCP's policy regarding the zero COVID. Like, not only is the PCR test to interpublic being abolished, but so are the health code. So we are seeing like many people in China now freaking out about this, especially considering that, I'm sorry, this is a little bit long, but especially considering that Chinese culture is a culture that really value like filial piety, so the elderly especially value in that case. What do you think is the long-term social repercussion of such a U-turn in policy towards COVID?
Andy may answer the first.
Professor Jonathan, if you can chime in to any of this. Yeah.
Well, on the warlord question, I think the asking of that question reflects the fear that many people have. If the Chinese Communist Party goes away, what will happen? And that fear is one of the reasons why I think, although Zhou Fengsuo, points out that people fundamentally want freedom, and I think many Chinese people, understand that they don't have freedom, but at the same time, they're afraid of what might happen if the Chinese Communist Party goes away, because there isn't any alternative to the Chinese Communist Party in the wings to take over. That's a little different from, for example, from Taiwan or Poland, where there were other strong political forces that could, and of course in the case of Taiwan, it was not a collapse of the KMT, but it was a top-down transition to democracy. Now the second question that was asked, I didn't have good audio, couldn't make it out, so I don't think I should address it. We don't want to take the time now to address it. On the third question, if I understood it correctly about the social impact of loosening up on the zero COVID, I was just reading, in fact, in the Financial Times this morning that Anthony Fauci, the American, advisor to Biden, who's stepping down on COVID policy, said that he's afraid that if China loosens up and doesn't do a big vaccination campaign, there's going to be 1 million deaths in China. Well, U.S. had 1 million deaths, but China's population is, I guess, about 4 times the size of the American population. So 1 million deaths in China would actually be a better performance than the American performance, but it would be a horrible tragedy and would, I think, carry the risk of creating a political crisis unless the government covers it up. I mean, we haven't spoken about this, but another one of the tools that the Chinese Communist Party had is the ability to cover up information. So there could be 1 million deaths and maybe nobody would know about it. I mean, you would know that in your community there were deaths, but you wouldn't know the national statistics. But I mean, it's a very scary situation. I mean, China, I do not think the Chinese Communist Party is going to collapse, or that the United States has the power to make it either collapse or yield anything, but I do think the Chinese Communist Party faces a lot of big problems. COVID is one. Aging population is one. Water shortage, excuse me, climate change. The slowing economy this year, apparently 3% growth, which is not enough for China. 3% growth in the United States is a good record. In China, though, that's not a good record, and there's a lot of people can't get jobs, people who were thrown out of work, businesses that closed. So, I mean, Xi Jinping has some very, very big challenges to face, but I don't dare to jump from that fact to the conclusion that the regime is going to fall, or that Xi Jinping himself will fall from power or be deposed from power. I just, you know, it'd be nice to imagine that, but as an analyst, I am not willing to predict that that's going to happen, because I see the regime as too solid.
Thank you so much, Professor Nathan. It always seems like, telling by your reaction, you may have a sort of like a different perspective on this, and Mr. Tongbiel as well. So if you can maybe elaborate on this too.
Yeah, I will answer question 2 first. I don't really have a good plan, a strategic answer. As I always said, we have to do something. Every day we have to think about something that we can do in the future, like for the final goal of China's freedom, our personal freedom, and China's democratization. There's a lot reason that to be pessimistic, but there's no excuse to stay passive. So in terms of what practically can happen, there's a lot, for example, social bonding that we should try to build. And with this eruption of protests, there are new opportunities for people to know each other. And so I think in the long term, the on-the-ground bonding is very important. And not only do we need protest, we need like normal social bonding, free from fear. Yeah. Book club, music, hiking. We should do more like that. And of course, there's lots of activities. For example, February 7th, Li Wenliang's death anniversary, and Tiananmen. There's a lot of it. And also, what's important, I think, we need some recognition of the tradition of freedom and democracy for China. Most people have no idea. One, I think the point that's really great that's becoming very popular, like a declaration of the protests now. I believe most people don't know the names, don't know all the names in that poem, like 我是谁, 我是. That's important to know. These people, they are Chinese. They are like the most admirable people in the world. That's that kind of legacy. I think young people today should learn, pick up. There's a lot we can do. I think Tongbiel was trying to write a book on that. There are several versions on the history of fight for freedom, democracy in China. That's one thing you can learn from.
We move on to Mr. Tongbiel, so we can also, so I apologize, gentlemen, we do have a time constraint, so we will take 2 more questions right after Mr. Tongbiel, and then we will wrap up.
Yeah, so the policies to deal with COVID is one thing, and the atrocities under the name of dealing with COVID is another thing. So people are extremely angry at the arbitrary detention, that people starved to death at their own home, and pets, dogs and cats were killed, and the doors and windows were locked like that. And that's one thing, the corruption. The Chinese government and so many companies that have very close connection with the government, they benefit hugely from the zero COVID policy. And what we can do, we can do a lot, because we can send information to the Chinese people. We can share information about the protests, like Chinese human rights. And that's very important. So that's gonna, if you tweet something, retweet something, that's very, very easy, and there seems to be nothing. But if the millions of retweets and clicks, that would be very powerful, and you can be volunteers to NGOs, and you can protest against those companies involving in the complicity in China's human rights violation, and you can also lobby. You can write to your representatives in the government, in the Congress, to make them, to push them to change their policy, that they should prioritize human rights in China.
Thank you so much. Yes?
So my question is, we hear a lot always about these protests that are going to go nowhere. Ever since Tiananmen, everybody says protests are going to happen, they go nowhere. But this time I see a change, and I want to hear your opinion on this change. There were 4 things in my mind that happened in the span of these few months that the Chinese people inside China got to see with their own eyes. To me, the first thing was the confusion of Hu Jintao at the party Congress meeting, and watching Xi Jinping's no reaction to that, number 1. 2, the bridge protests that got out there really quickly. Number 3, the idea that everyone is watching soccer, whether you're in China or whether you are wherever you are, and they got to see that people around the world are free during COVID. They're not restricted, they're not locked in their houses. And then, of course, number 4 was the just horrific tragedy of the Uyghurs being locked in their home, and a family just being burned alive. So with those 4 things in the eyesight of the Chinese people, how do you think that might change it compared to normal protests about pollution and everything that happens, on an ongoing basis?
Thank you so much. We can take 1 more question. Yes, ma'am. If you can project your question, it would be great. So we don't.
I totally like Mr. Zhou's suggestion for that. One thing we want to realize about the city of China, that one thing we might need to do is that we need to down the environment. Because like right now in China, I think many people, and now they don't even know that protests exist. They don't even know why this policy is not being changed. And because there is no independent news media in China, and people don't have access to VPN right now. They cannot let them download VPN from any app store. They couldn't find it, and they have no access to independent news media. So many of these people just don't know, and they don't know what happened to Uyghurs, what happened in Xinjiang. They don't know what really happened in Hong Kong, and they don't really know what happened to many people who are suffering during COVID, right? So, but my question would be, then what can we do to make this happen? What could we do we can try to help
Thank you. So we will give each panelist 2 minutes to answer the question. Professor Andrew Nathan, if you can go first, please.
Okay. Well, I think a lot of the stuff that the first questioner asked that Chinese people don't know about Hu Jintao that wasn't broadcast. What was the second thing? So there's a lot of things they don't know, but I think they're living in a different information environment from the one that we're in. There are a lot of things we don't know that they perceive. You know, there's a lot. So we need to transport ourselves into the mindset of a person living in China, and then to recognize that the Chinese people, like us, have very, very complicated attitudes. They know a lot of different things, and they have a lot of different attitudes, some of which I've alluded to before. For example, you know, I think they know they're not free, but on the other hand, they're used to that way of life. And most people are just going about their ordinary lives, really, in China, rather than thinking very politically most of the time. And then I mentioned before the fear of chaos, I think, is one of the things that they appreciate public order. Many people are living a very mundane life. They have their work, they have their car, they have their apartment payment, they go to the park, they do entertainment and things like that. It's not on the political edge the way that I think many of us see it as a sort of brewing crisis. But of course, I do agree with Joe Funfla that sooner or later something happens in China, and it's always a surprise. We don't know now what it's going to be. But I would go back to my point that in 1989, a key point was the government didn't crack down right away. That's what gave space, oxygen, to people to surface, to move from their passive attitude of accepting the state of affairs is what it is, into a vision that maybe it could be different.
Thank you so much. Mr. Tongbiel.
You're welcome.
Okay, so your question is that I think you're saying basically these four things could cause change, right, in people's mind. Yeah. These are not ordinary things. The economic grievance, it's more like national, political, and I think that's probably true to some degree because what happened in China is that the government controls the narrative, and the way like now internet works, like everything happens at the moment, and the next moment there's something else, and the government is very good at basically occupying people's mind with things that they want to impose on. So they control the focal point. That's the problem. That could wash away everything. If that's happening, and so people become like just so like atomic. Like you have no connection to other people, no sympathy, and you have no connection to your past and the future. That's the kind of situation that the society is becoming without access to free information. Yeah. So for people, for example, the protesters, I think they are mostly Twitter users. We can feel like that from the interviews we can see. So that's very important. I think this also related to her question. This is very crucial. I don't really have a good answer, but there's a lot of things that happen done by volunteers that's really remarkable. For example, the Great Translation. That translates everything from China into English, and that's providing some perspective on this. In terms of transporting things back to China, information back to China, it's really a challenge. But I think at least for a brief period, this was happening. Even on Douyin, on WeChat, on Weibo, there were like protesting, rebellious messages. And some people even tell me on Douyin it's like full of 反贼信息, for a while. That can happen. But what's important is that this free community outside of China, we need to nurture it, make sure it thrives. Like we do whatever. This is where things could happen. Ideas could come out and eventually could lead to big change. This virtual community.
Mr. Tongbiel?
Yeah, so I combined the two questions. So we can make a brief comparison with 1989. So in 1989, there was not internet, and then after that, internet was developed very rapidly in China. Even though the censorship is there, but everyone has a smartphone, and then technically it's not possible for the Communist Party to censor the internet information as they censor the traditional media. That's one thing. And there's so many Chinese people enlightened by the idea for liberal democracy. And the political, so the future revolution, the political change, it will not be like one single leader, influential leader, secretly organize a nationwide protest. That's not likely. That's not possible. It must be one trigger event that nobody could predict, and like this time, and nobody predict the victims in Urumqi could spark the national anger. And we remember in 1976. The people just wanted to commemorate Zhou Enlai, and 1989 the death of Hu Yaobang. So people didn't have a concrete plan or a comprehensive plan, and this time too. So the people in Shanghai, most people in Shanghai, both protesters there, just wanted to attend the vigil. They want to commemorate the death, the victims in Urumqi. And then, so when there's an atmosphere and when there's accumulated anger and frustration, and there's like a civil consciousness, the demand, the desire for democracy, and then it's a kind of a natural for people to chant Xi Jinping and Communist Party step down.
Thank you so much. That concludes our panel. But before we finish, we will be announcing two things. Number one, we'll be conducting a moment of silence for all those affected by the COVID lockdown. So if everyone can please stand up. Please remember all those that have lost their lives especially, and have their families still being affected in one way, shape, or the other. So. Thank you. And the next one, we encourage everyone in the audience to please come and talk to our panelists. Professor, if you want to stick around with us to talk to your young students, I'm sure some of them are in your class. But other than that, we thank everyone sincerely for coming tonight. We especially thank our friends at CCP Columbia who has took their time and effort to really help us to make this event possible at Columbia University. And on behalf of the Catholic Nations Coalition of the CPDC, we thank you all, and God bless you, and have a good night.
Thank you.
就是说，因为
petition，我们就在曼哈顿。但我家里还有。We always volunteer.